When the paddle hit the ball, the system provided a consistent electrical signal. But when the paddle missed, the electrical signal turned unpredictable, effectively punishing the neurons. And over a very short time, the network learned to play better. This experiment was called Dishbrain, and it proved something that researchers had been pondering for over 40 years. But in order to figure out what it proved, we have to first ask an important question. Why do humans learn so much more efficiently than AI? To understand why the brain uses so much less energy than ChatGPT, we have to understand what both are made of. LLMs, or large language models, use GPUs, or graphics processing units, to do dense matrix multiplications on large amounts of data really quickly. From the way I described it, the GPU might sound amazing, but there's actually a fatal flaw built into the design. GPUs run on the von Neumann architecture of computing, which means that their memory and their computation happen in different parts of the chip. In fact, up to 90% of all the energy that a GPU uses is to transport data rather than to do computations. So how is that different from the brain? Well, the brain stores information in the exact same place where the computations happen, the neuron. But what if I told you there was already a different architecture that was already inspired by the brain? In 1989, Carver Mead designed a prototype of a circuit that was intended to mimic a biological neural system. And in 1991, researchers at Caltech had found a way to make those circuits imitate the retina, officially designing the first neuromorphic vision circuit. But after this, the research into bio-inspired compute was largely overshadowed by conventional computing. This used the von Neumann architecture because the cost of making smaller and smaller semiconductors was falling rapidly, and with it, the energy cost of transporting data. That was until IBM realized a bottleneck. Splitting your compute and your memory is fine, just as long as you keep decreasing the distance between them. But researchers discovered that you could only make semiconductors a little bit smaller than they already are. And the smaller they get, the more expensive they get. So what did they propose instead? In 2014, IBM released their first large-scale brain-inspired chip called TrueNorth after just 6 years of development. It was nothing like any conventional chip that came before it, differing in 4 unique ways. First, the hardware looked like a 2D map of the brain. They laid out 4,096 neurosynaptic cores with 256 neurons per core. This means that, unlike conventional hardware, neurons weren't an abstraction. They were actually built into the hardware. Second, neurons weren't continuous output machines like they are in digital neural networks. The neurons only fire when an event happens, meaning that energy isn't wasted on dense matrix multiplications. Third, the processor allows for the 4,096 cores to operate in parallel, meaning that the chip can operate on multiple different tasks at one time. And finally, it wasn't and still isn't available for public purchase, so I can't buy one, which makes me furious. So what does stealing human neurons to play Pong prove about AI? Well, researchers found that not only could actual human neurons learn more with less energy and data, but they also learned that computer chips designed to mimic the structure of the brain could do the same. Here's how. Instead of processing every frame like a normal neural network, an SNN, or spiking neural network, converts changes in the game into spikes. Those spikes travel through layers of artificial neurons, whose membrane potentials change as spikes arrive. When a neuron reaches its threshold, it fires another spike, which then influences downstream neurons and ultimately moves the paddle. After each action, the system receives a reward or penalty, depending on whether the paddle successfully tracks or hits the ball. A learning rule then slightly changes the strength of the connections between neurons. Over many interactions, connections that produce successful actions are strengthened, while those associated with poor actions are weakened. This process works, but it's still missing something: neuroplasticity. If you're watching this video, your brain likely isn't fully developed, and that's actually a good thing. It's called neuroplasticity, and it's where your brain is more capable of rewiring itself and changing the strength of connections between brain cells. And researchers have actually discovered a way to give this property of neuroplasticity to computer hardware. This is a memristor, and it can change physical properties through stimulation. Imagine a computer chip that takes the electrical impulses that it gets from signals and uses those to change the hardware like a brain. But how does it decide the correct way to change? Your brain is capable of training itself using a 4-letter acronym, STDP, and it stands for Spike Timing Dependent Plasticity. What does that even mean? Well, let's imagine 2 neurons in your brain. One gets really excited and decides to fire a spike. In response, the other neuron connected to it decides to spike as well. In this case, using STDP rules, the connection between these neurons would get stronger because the brain thinks that the first one caused the other one to fire. But if the second neuron fires and then shortly after the first neuron fires, the connection actually gets weaker because there likely isn't a causal link. Interestingly, brain-like chips can use STDP to update their own connections, but even that's not enough. Let's look at the game of Pong for a second. In order for a clump of neurons to learn how to play the game, they have to understand good and bad outcomes. So, in order to teach a brain-like computer to play Pong, you also have to teach it good and bad outcomes. So, how do you reward a brain-like computer for making the right connections? Well, we already established that you can reward the right neuron timing, but now we need to introduce a reward signal. When the paddle hits a ball, you send a reward signal throughout the network. The neurons that were active leave traces of their activity locally, and upon receiving a global reward signal, the network asks how active they were when rewarding the action. Then each synapse is strengthened in accordance with how much it contributed to the success. This is the idea behind eligibility traces. Neurons fire, synapses remember, and connections change because of reward signals. And suddenly, we have something that looks like a human brain, made entirely out of silicon. For decades, we've tried to scale AI to human-level intelligence by just throwing more energy, data, and silicon at the problem. But humans learn so well, not because they consume so much more energy or data, but because they are efficient with what energy and data they are already given. If you actually want to understand what happens behind AI and be able to build it, make sure to subscribe and go to graduateml.com for free machine learning projects and practice that you can code and compile in your browser.